Have you ever imagined yourself sitting on a flight, finally relaxing after a long and stressful week, when suddenly you're asked to give up your seat just because another passenger's considered a VIP? Well, that's exactly what happened to Leonard Hayes, the CEO of Horizon Capital, while he was seated in 2C business class on SkyWay Flight 512 from Atlanta to New York. Leonard was dressed simply in a suit, no tie, his laptop open as he reviewed financial reports, sipping on a glass of juice. Around him was the calm, elegant atmosphere of business class passengers reading books, typing on laptops, quietly minding their own world. Out of nowhere, Clint Morrison, the chief flight attendant, walked up and asked Leonard to move to seat 4F so a wealthy VIP could take his place. Now, pause for a second. If that were you, what would you do? Would you give up your seat, or would you stand your ground and protect your legal rights? Leonard politely refused, staying calm. But deep down, that familiar sting of being singled out, judged because of the color of his skin, started to rise. Before he could process it all, the so-called VIP, Victor Lane, stepped in, demanding Leonard's seat, and suddenly the entire cabin went quiet. All eyes were on them. Would Leonard let anger take over, or would he use his intelligence to turn the tables? Make sure to hit like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel as we dive into this intense yet incredibly inspiring story. A flight that seemed so ordinary is about to become an unforgettable lesson about power, dignity, and courage. Leonard Hayes, the CEO of Horizon Capital, quietly stepped onto SkyWay Flight 512 from Atlanta to New York. From the very moment he set foot in the business class cabin, you could tell he wasn't like the typical VIP passengers people usually imagine, wrapped in flashy suits, expensive ties, and judgmental stares. He wore a simple, minimalistic suit, the top button of his white shirt left undone, a small laptop in hand. His steps were calm, steady, and confident. There was something special about Leonard, an undeniable sense of composure, a quiet strength in the way he moved, as if he had just walked out of a high-pressure financial boardroom and still carried his clarity intact. He knew exactly who he was and what his true worth was. Seat 2C in business class welcomed Leonard like a place he had carefully chosen weeks in advance. Soft light from the airplane window spilled across the cabin. Leather seats in rich brown tones, passengers casually sipping juice or champagne, scrolling through laptops or books together, creating a picture of quiet luxury and subtle power. Leonard set his small briefcase beside him, opened his laptop, and began reviewing the end-of-quarter reports, his eyes gliding over numbers the way they had for most of his life. But today, even in these first few moments of the flight, a quiet unease crept into his mind. Will I really be treated fairly in this space? It was a question he had encountered time and time again in his career, from investor meetings, to business lunches, to international trips. He drew in a soft breath, reminding himself to stay focused. Not because of fear, but because he understood something most people don't. Power isn't just about your title or the number in your bank account. Leonard knew that sometimes intellect and unwavering resolve are the most powerful weapons you can have, especially when faced with injustice. As his eyes scanned the cabin, he noticed polite but distant smiles and quick, curious glances that seemed to ask whether he belonged in this space, whether he was part of the safe zone of this elite class. It wasn't the first time he felt it, the subtle kind of discrimination, faint yet sharp enough to make someone like Leonard stay alert. Around him, A passenger opened their laptop. Music played softly in their headphones. Someone else took a sip of champagne. It looked like just another business-class scene. But Leonard wasn't the kind of man who simply blended in. He understood the value of reading the room. Every glance, every small gesture, every unspoken word could reveal how people truly felt about him. He opened an important email, but his ears stayed alert to the quiet rustle of the cabin like a reflex built from years of tough negotiations and watching how environments shift before conflicts begin. Have you ever wondered, if you were in Leonard's shoes sitting on that plane, having paid for the seat you rightfully chose and then realizing a so-called VIP might walk in and demand to take it from you, what would you do? Would you give it up, just to keep the peace, or would you calmly protect your rightful place, knowing that every move you make sends a message about dignity and power? Leonard chose the second option. He didn't yell, didn't raise his voice. He stayed calm because he understood that sometimes calmness itself forces others to reconsider their power. The soft light from the window fell across Leonard's face, highlighting his calm yet determined features. With his minimalist suit and one hand resting on his laptop, he looked like a strategist observing the whole battlefield, but in truth, he was watching every detail, the positions of the flight attendants, the expressions of the passengers, and subtle signs of who might become the first challenge. Leonard didn't just see the surface. He saw the mechanisms of power, prejudice, and how people respond to someone who isn't quite like them. Outside the window, the Atlanta sky was slowly brightening, but Leonard knew the real challenge wasn't altitude or airspeed. It was about staying steady in your values and using intelligence when facing unfairness. He took a sip of coffee, but his mind stayed alert, ready for whatever shift might come next. The other passengers reading newspapers, sipping champagne, dozing off had no idea that a quiet power struggle was forming right there in business class. This flight, which seemed so ordinary, was about to become, for Leonard Hayes, the beginning of a profound lesson about power, dignity, and how humans react when they're disrespected. He didn't need to shout or cause a scene. His intelligence, steadfastness, and sharp awareness were his armor, and maybe, if you were sitting beside him, you might just realize this ordinary-looking man in a simple suit might be the one who holds the power to change not just his own story, but the entire situation unfolding in that cabin. Just as Leonard Hayes set his laptop down to take a quiet sip of coffee, firm footsteps echoed near the business-class cabin. Clint Morrison, the chief flight attendant of SkyWay 512, approached Leonard with a polite smile, yet behind his eyes was the rigid weight of duty. "Excuse me, Mr. Hayes," Clint said, his voice calm but firm. "We need you to move to seat 4F so we can accommodate a VIP passenger." Leonard slightly furrowed his brows, not out of anger, but because he had already anticipated something like this. Seat 2C wasn't random. He had chosen it deliberately and paid for it 3 weeks in advance. He wasn't someone who picked fights. In fact, Leonard was the kind of man who calculated every step, but this time, a quiet, familiar feeling began to rise inside him. The feeling of being pushed aside, of not belonging in a place he had every right to be. This wasn't just a seat. It was a right proof that no matter how others saw him, he had earned his place here. Have you ever been put in a situation where you felt excluded, even though you knew you were completely in the right? If that was you, would you give in just to avoid conflict, or would you stay calm and stand your ground, just like Leonard was about to do? He took a quiet breath, placed his hand gently on the armrest, and replied with steady composure, "I booked and paid for this seat 3 weeks ago. I'm not able to move." Clint raised his eyebrows for a second, hesitating, but kept his professional smile. "You understand the situation, don't you? This passenger has paid a significant amount of money, and they specifically requested this seat. We're hoping you can be understanding." Leonard nodded slowly, but in his eyes there was a calm, unwavering resolve. He didn't need to shout or show anger. All he needed was clarity, logic, and consistency. He knew that when people try to use financial influence to force their will, reacting emotionally only weakens your real power, your intellect, and integrity. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted slightly, but noticeably. A few passengers glanced over. Someone frowned. Someone else quietly sipped their drink. Everyone was waiting to see what Leonard would do. This was the kind of moment where soft power, calmness, certainty could create a surprisingly strong impact. Leonard felt it clearly. Every pair of eyes was measuring him. Whatever he decided wouldn't just determine where he sat, it would define how people in that cabin saw him. But beneath that composure, the sting of disrespect lingered. Leonard remembered board meetings at Horizon Capital when his ideas were dismissed not because they were wrong, but because people weren't used to seeing a black man in a position of power. He remembered business lunches, the subtle doubts, the times he had to prove his ability twice as hard as his white colleagues. These memories didn't make him angry, they made him steady. They reminded him that calmness and reason weren't weaknesses. They were weapons. "Clint," Leonard said, his voice low but steady, "I can't give up my seat. I'm sure we can find a reasonable solution. It wasn't a challenge. It was a declaration of inner authority, not the kind built on money or titles, but on knowing your own worth and using reason to protect your rightful place." Clint inhaled slowly and nodded, as if deciding how to respond next. Leonard could sense a slight shift in the attendant's demeanor just for a moment, because sometimes refusing to be pushed around calmly creates a kind of pressure no one expects. Can you imagine that feeling, sitting in the seat you paid for, knowing someone with more money, status, or influence might take it from you, but you stay firm, completely steady, not with anger, but with clarity and logic? That's exactly where Leonard Hayes was. He didn't insult anyone. He didn't cause a scene. He simply used a kind of power most people overlook: self-control, logic, dignity. A few passengers looked his way, some curious, some quietly impressed. Someone even gave a faint, knowing smile, as if they recognized that in this luxurious, polished cabin, a different kind of power was being displayed, not the power of wealth or fame, but of reason and self-respect. Yes, the feeling of exclusion was still there, but Leonard turned it into fuel, strengthening his resolve to protect his rightful space. This moment wasn't just about a seat. It was about who gets to define fairness in a place where wealth and status usually come first. And Leonard Hayes, with nothing but calm confidence, drew a clear line. This is my right, and I won't surrender it just because someone else is labeled VIP. These thoughts flowed through Leonard's mind like a slow but powerful river. He reminded himself being firm doesn't mean being stubborn. It means being observant, evaluating the situation, and choosing the right moment to act. He braced himself because deep down, he knew the true power struggle was only beginning, and his calmness would be his strongest weapon. With steady eyes, Leonard sat upright, took a sip of his coffee, and thought to himself, What happens next will show who really holds the power. This moment connects perfectly from part 1, the sharp observation, the calm control, the awareness of hidden bias. All of it continues here, building the foundation for what's about to unfold next, from the direct confrontation with the VIP passenger to the brilliant way Leonard will flip the balance of power in this cabin. The air inside the cabin seemed to grow heavier after Leonard Hayes's firm yet polite refusal. The engines hummed steadily outside, and the warm, dim cabin lights brushed softly across his face. Chief Flight Attendant Clint Morrison had just walked away, leaving behind an unusual stillness, the kind of silence that lingers right after authority has been challenged, but before it figures out how to respond. Leonard took another sip of his coffee. He had no idea that the next few minutes would test his resolve more than anything else today, and would mark the beginning of a confrontation no one in this cabin would forget. The business class door slid open. A tall man in his early 50s stepped inside, salt and pepper hair, light-colored suit, the confident posture of someone used to being treated like royalty. This was Victor Lane, a well-known figure in the aviation investment world, and SkyWay's unquestioned #1 VIP, a man who spent over $300 million a year on private and first-class air travel. Clint moved quickly to greet him, his voice dropping slightly out of respect. "Mr. Lane, welcome back. Everything is ready for you. There's just a small seating issue." Victor raised an eyebrow, his expression cool and assured. He glanced briefly at the seating list, then looked toward Leonard's seat. "A seating issue," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I always sit in 2C. The airline knows that." Leonard didn't say anything at first. He simply looked up and gently closed his laptop. His eyes didn't challenge, but they didn't back down either. When he spoke, his voice was low and clear. "This is the seat I booked and paid for 3 weeks ago." For a second, the cabin froze. A few passengers paused what they were doing. Fingers hovered above keyboards. Someone slowly pulled out an earbud to listen. Clint forced a polite smile. "Yes, Mr. Lane, it's an unfortunate overlap, but I'm sure we can work something out." "No," Leonard interrupted, softly but firmly. "I understand he may be a frequent traveler, but this is my ticket, my seat. I have no reason to move." His tone was strangely calm, not confrontational, just certain, and that calmness, that quiet certainty, made people around them sit up a little straighter. They could feel it. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was someone defending his right to exist, without raising his voice. Victor let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh that carries money and influence in every note. "I don't think the airline will let this stand. You do know who I am, right?" Leonard met his gaze, steady and unshaken. "Actually, I don't, but I know exactly who I am." A soft murmur rippled through the cabin, an almost audible wow. It wasn't because Leonard was aggressive. He wasn't. It was because of how he said it slowly, clearly, confidently, like a man who didn't need anyone's permission to exist. Victor stepped back half a pace, his eyes cooling. "You don't understand. I don't enjoy arguments. I've paid this airline hundreds of millions. I'm not going to. And Leonard said, still calm, paid for this ticket, just like every other passenger. We're on the same flight. Mr. Lane." The way he said Mr. Lane changed the air in the room. It wasn't mocking. It was precise, almost a reminder right now. We are just two passengers, nothing more, nothing less. Clint began to panic. "Gentlemen, please, let's stay calm." "I'm sure," calm Victor snapped, turning to Clint, voice sharper now. "Do you know who I am? I pay for respect priority. And now I'm standing here arguing with someone who shouldn't even be in that seat to begin with." The tension became almost physical, thick in the air. Some passengers looked away, others looked straight at Leonard, then at Victor, then back at Clint, waiting. Leonard still didn't raise his voice. He just looked back at Victor, eyes steady, expression unreadable, no anger, no retreat, just silence. A silence that wasn't weak. It was powerful, like he was letting the truth speak louder than words. Have you ever seen someone get publicly disrespected, and instead of exploding in anger, they stayed completely silent, but in that silence there was strength. So much strength that the whole room had to stop and feel it. That was this moment. Clint tried to regain control, but his voice trembled. "Mr. Lane, perhaps I should call the cabin supervisor to handle this properly." "You should," Leonard replied, still composed. "I'm confident the airline's records will clearly show who booked this seat." Another pause. Victor folded his arms, anger simmering beneath the surface but with no immediate move left to make. Leonard opened his laptop again, as if the confrontation hadn't shaken him at all. He wasn't trying to win. He was simply protecting what was right. Outside, wind whispered against the aircraft's frame, a subtle soundtrack to the rising tension. An elderly passenger across the aisle slowly shook his head and whispered to the person beside him, "This world is strange. Sometimes the people with real power don't need to shout to prove it." He was right. Leonard knew it too. He understood that this wasn't over. But he also knew one thing for certain in any conflict. The first person to lose their composure loses. So he chose silence. He chose reason. He chose dignity. This story isn't finished yet, because in just a few minutes, when the cabin supervisor arrives, everything will reach a new level where justice, dignity, and real power will be tested in the rawest way possible. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, almost dense after that brief but tense confrontation. Clint Morrison had stepped away to reconfirm the seating information, while Victor Lane stood motionless, arms crossed, staring at Leonard like he was just waiting for him to slip up, just waiting for a reason to unleash his anger. Leonard remained still. He didn't avoid Victor's gaze, but he didn't challenge it either. Instead, he turned back to his laptop, opened the unfinished financial report not to actually read it, but to keep himself anchored, to stop his mind from drifting into anger, an emotion he had spent years learning to control. What had happened might seem small to some, a seat, a request to move, but to Leonard, it was more than that. He could feel it in the glances, in the subtle body language of the people around him, the feeling of being different, of having to prove that he deserved to be there. Have you ever been in a room where people weren't openly disrespectful to you, but they didn't fully accept you either? They smiled politely, spoke with perfect manners, yet there was an invisible gap, like you were allowed to be present, but never truly belong. Leonard had spent his entire life in that space between acceptance and exclusion. Back when he was an engineer at Boeing, he once worked on a jet engine design team. He proposed a modification that could reduce fuel consumption by 12%. His supervisor dismissed it, saying it was too risky. 6 months later, that exact design resurfaced this time, presented by a white colleague, and it was celebrated as a breakthrough. Leonard didn't complain, but he remembered. In investor meetings, he was often asked, "Are you from the technical department?" because they couldn't believe a black man was the CEO. At upscale restaurants, waiters would sometimes hand the bill to the person sitting next to him, assuming Leonard couldn't possibly be the one paying. These weren't wounds that fully healed. They stayed quiet, hidden, and sometimes, like now, they bled again. Leonard slowly looked up. His eyes met those of a middle-aged woman in the row across from him. She looked at him not with pity, but with understanding, and gave a slight nod, a small gesture, yet enough to remind him he wasn't completely alone. He offered her a faint smile, then turned back to his screen. His hands were steady, no shaking, no anger. In his mind, he could hear his mother's voice, a former elementary school teacher from southern Georgia, saying, "You don't have to shout to prove you're strong, Leonard. You just have to stand without bowing your head." He had lived by those words his whole life. And here, on SkyWay Flight 512, surrounded by silent judgment, he was living them again. But Victor wasn't done yet. He muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Interesting. I guess they let just anyone sit in business class nowadays." He didn't say it directly. He didn't have to. Leonard understood every layer of what he meant. He looked up just for a moment and met Victor's eyes. There was no anger there, just a firm, unbroken silence. And that silence made Victor uneasy, as if he was suddenly looking into a mirror he wasn't prepared for. The tension no longer came from words, but from what wasn't being said. People in the cabin started feeling uncomfortable, not because of Leonard, but because they were beginning to realize something about themselves, about what they were witnessing. Some glanced at Leonard, then quickly away. The calmness in the air now carried a subtle sting of guilt. Leonard felt his throat dry up, but he still said nothing. He knew if he let emotion take over, logic would evaporate, and if he lost his temper, people wouldn't remember the injustice, they would only remember the black man who lost control. So he chose the harder path, silence, guided by intelligence. He picked up his phone and typed a quick message to Sarah Mitchell, Horizon Capital's legal counsel on SkyWay 512. Seat reassignment issue, possible racial bias, documenting everything. Then he turned on audio recording, a simple move, but it spoke volumes about who he was, someone who faced conflict not with rage, but with reason. A soft ding signaled the Wi-Fi connection was now stable. Leonard opened his browser and continued working, as if nothing had happened. But inside his mind, every detail was being carefully recorded, tone of voice, expressions, words. He wasn't letting anger consume him. He was letting the truth build its own case. And in that moment, Leonard realized the irony. Those who had just underestimated him would soon learn he wasn't just any passenger. Outside the window, the deep blue sky stretched endlessly. Sunlight bounced off the frame and lit his face, the face of a man who had endured quiet prejudice many times, but never let it define him. The tension in the cabin still hadn't been resolved, but Leonard understood something important. Truth doesn't have to rush. What was happening now was only the surface of a much bigger story, a story about how humans treat each other when power and prejudice collide. He allowed himself a small, calm smile. His eyes looked forward, distant, as if whispering to himself, "They'll understand one day. Not because I shouted, but because the truth won't stay hidden forever." The plane still hadn't taken off, but somewhere in this business-class cabin, a quiet revolution had already begun, born from calm, intelligence, and the unwavering dignity of a man who refused to let society define him by his skin or his status. The air inside the SkyWay Flight 512 felt so thick you could almost cut through it. The tension was no longer something only Leonard sensed. It had spread quietly across the surrounding rows like an invisible wave. Victor Lane was still standing near seat 2C, arms crossed, his face flushed red with anger. Meanwhile, Chief Flight Attendant Clint Morrison spoke in a hushed, anxious voice through his headset. From a distance, a few passengers discreetly raised their phones, recording what they instinctively felt was not a normal situation. Leonard sat still, his expression calm. He didn't need anyone to tell him he knew this had gone far beyond a simple seat misunderstanding. This was now a matter of prejudice, power, and personal dignity. He took a quiet breath, unlocked his phone, and typed out a message with deliberate care. A short sentence, but packed with weight. Sarah, I'm on SkyWay 512. Signs of discrimination. I'm being asked to move for a VIP passenger despite having a valid ticket. Please document. Sarah Mitchell, more than just his personal attorney. She had stood by his side in legal battles about fairness and personal rights. She knew Leonard better than most. He didn't involve lawyers to start a war. He involved them to make sure justice stayed in its rightful place. After sending the message, Leonard opened the audio recorder on his phone. A small, quiet action, but incredibly powerful. He didn't need to speak loudly, he just needed to preserve the truth. To him, the truth had always been the most undeniable evidence. Clint returned, forcing a polite smile onto his face. Mr. Hayes, I apologize for the inconvenience, but the VIP passenger insists that seat 2C is his. I've called the cabin supervisor to handle the situation. Leonard nodded, his voice calm. Thank you. I'm willing to wait. I just want this resolved according to policy and the truth. A simple sentence, but it made Clint pause. In that brief moment, he realized the man sitting before him wasn't someone who could be pushed aside with authority alone. A few minutes later, cabin supervisor Evans arrived, tall, lean, early 40s, brown hair, and the firm, collected expression of someone who had handled hundreds of in-flight issues. He stepped forward, his gaze shifting between Victor Lane and Leonard Hayes. Good afternoon. I'm Evans, cabin supervisor for SkyWay Airlines. I was told there's a seating dispute. Leonard gave a slight nod. There's no dispute, sir. I booked and paid for seat 2C 3 weeks ago. I can show you the confirmation email. He pulled up the digital ticket on his phone and showed it. Evans glanced at the screen, then nodded. It's valid, he said quietly, turning to Clint with a more serious tone. Have you checked the system? Clint swallowed hard. I'm in the process, sir. Victor interrupted, voice rising. I'm a Platinum Plus customer. I spend hundreds of millions each year. I always sit in that seat. And I will not. Evans lifted a hand, cutting him off with calm authority. Mr. Lane, I understand your status with the airline, but a paid seat is a paid seat. No one is allowed to take another passenger's seat regardless of who they are. The cabin went silent. Then hushed whispers began rolling through the rows. He's right. That man handled himself so well. Fair is fair. Leonard didn't say a word. He simply gave Evans a quiet, respectful nod. Inside, he felt no triumph. Because for him, fairness wasn't about winning, it was about staying rational when everyone else lost control. Have you ever been in a moment where one burst of anger could ruin everything? Leonard had been there before many times, and he learned that calmness sometimes forces others to see themselves more clearly than any argument ever could. The tension still floated in the air, but the focus of the story had shifted. People were no longer looking at Leonard as the man asked to give up his seat. They were seeing him as someone whose dignity was being tested in public. Leonard's phone vibrated gently. A reply from Sarah lit up the screen. Record everything. Do not argue further. I'm contacting SkyWay's legal department. If they violate passenger rights, we'll file an official complaint. Leonard read the message, nodded slightly. He knew he wasn't alone. There were people like Sarah, people who fought with reasoning, not rage. Supervisor Evans leaned toward Clint, voice low but clear enough for Leonard to hear. You should apologize to the passenger. This situation began because of an unprofessional handling of the seating issue. Clint's face flushed red. He stepped toward Leonard, bowing his head slightly. Mr. Hayes, I sincerely apologize for this inconvenience. There seems to have been a misunderstanding on our end, Leonard replied softly, without bitterness. It's all right. I understand your job isn't easy. I just hope everything is handled fairly. Evans nodded, and we will make sure of that, sir. It felt like the tension might finally settle, but somewhere in that cabin, Victor Lane was still refusing to accept it. He muttered about elite customer privileges and respect owed to loyalty. But with every word, more passengers began to look at Leonard not with pity, but with respect. Leonard reopened his laptop, typed a few more lines on his report, as if none of this had shaken him. He didn't want to be seen as a victim. Just a man who believed dignity can't be bought, and respect doesn't come from status. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted across the airplane window, lighting his face. A few passengers gave a small nod, perhaps out of solidarity. A gentleman in seat 3A even whispered softly, "You handled that perfectly." Sometimes silence is the strongest answer. Leonard gave a faint smile, but didn't respond. In his mind, his mother's words echoed once more when others shout, "Speak with reason. When they use power, answer with truth." The plane still hadn't taken off, but inside SkyWay 512, the balance of power had quietly shifted. And it didn't shift because of status or wealth. It shifted because of intelligence, composure, and dignity. Inside the business-class cabin of SkyWay Flight 512, it felt as though the air had stopped moving. Every sound seemed suppressed, only the soft hum of the air vents and the faint metallic click of service trays remained. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted into something quieter, heavier, a waiting game. Supervisor Evans, wearing the composed expression of someone familiar with crisis, stepped toward the digital check-in terminal. Holding a tablet, he spoke as his fingers moved swiftly across the screen. "All right, we're going to verify the booking system now. I want everything to be absolutely clear." Leonard Hayes gave a small nod, still seated, still calm. He didn't feel the need to justify himself. The truth, when solid, doesn't need a raised voice to stand. Clint Morrison stood nearby, still clutching his headset, his face a mixture of anxiety and embarrassment. Behind them, Victor Lane exhaled sharply, arms crossed, impatience painted all over his features. "Come on," he muttered. "We don't have all day for this." Evans didn't respond. His focus stayed on the screen. Seconds passed. Then he stopped and read out loud, slowly, clearly, each word heavy with meaning. "Business class. Seat 2C, passenger Leonard Hayes, booked and paid for 22 days ago, valid, no system changes. A silence so thick you could touch it spread across the cabin. Evans looked up first at Clint, then at Victor Lane. "There is no mistake," he said firmly. "This seat belongs to Mr. Hayes." A few passengers let out a quiet "oh." Others exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, not because the result was surprising, but because it had taken this much effort just to acknowledge something so simple. Leonard didn't smile in triumph. He only nodded gently, as if this outcome had always been obvious. "Thank you, Supervisor Evans," he said, his voice steady. "I understand you're under pressure, but I believe rules exist to protect all passengers, not just a select few." Evans gave a respectful nod. Clint said nothing. He simply lowered his head, shoulders stiff with discomfort. Victor Lane, on the other hand, shifted from anger to visible discomfort. He looked around, as if searching for someone to back him up. No one did. In that moment, the cabin became an audience to a quiet reversal. The man who had been dismissed was now the one being defended by the system, by fairness. "Trying to recover," Clint spoke softly. "Mr. Hayes, as an apology, the airline can offer you a $500 voucher for your next flight, or an upgrade in service on this one." Leonard shook his head gently. "That won't be necessary. I'm not looking for compensation, just fairness." It was a simple answer, but it made people glance at him again. Sometimes, dignity is only recognized when someone refuses to sell it. Evans stepped forward and addressed the cabin. "We apologize for the delay. We'll be preparing for takeoff shortly." The air began to loosen, the soft clicking of seat belts, quiet typing on laptops, hushed conversations slowly returned. But there was a quiet understanding in the atmosphere something had changed, not just in the flight, but in how people inside this cabin saw one another. Leonard opened his laptop again, but this time he didn't start working. He looked out the window instead. The late afternoon sky was turning amber. In that still moment, memories came back of all the times he'd had to prove his worth, not with loud words, but with composure, intelligence, and resilience. Have you ever felt tired of having to prove you deserved what others receive without question? Leonard had lived that feeling most of his life. But today, on what seemed like an ordinary flight, he realized something deeper. Justice isn't just about the result. It's about how you carry yourself on the way there. Victor Lane now sat in silence, avoiding Leonard's eyes. He took out his phone, pretending to be occupied, though uncertainty lingered on his face. The man who was used to giving orders suddenly didn't know where to place himself. Supervisor Evans walked over quietly and said, "Mr. Hayes, thank you for your patience. Not everyone could stay that composed in a situation like this." Leonard smiled softly. "I learned it from my mother. She used to tell me, when someone shouts in your face, let your silence be the mirror they have to look into." Evans nodded with a small, genuine smile. Maybe he had learned that lesson somewhere in his own life, too. The cabin returned to order, but it wasn't the same order as before. It was one rebuilt on fairness, not force, and everyone there understood sometimes. One person who refuses to bend can make an entire system stop, reflect, and realign itself. In the fading light, Leonard glanced around and caught a few subtle smiles from nearby passengers. He nodded back, quietly. There was no announcement of victory, but there was a victory, a silent one, A victory of intellect over bias, of calm over power, of dignity over arrogance, and like a quiet line of music playing in his mind, he thought if just one person dares to stand up for what's right, maybe the world will begin to change one moment at a time. The aircraft began to roll slowly toward the runway, but this story and Leonard's journey was far from over. Up in the cockpit, Captain Michael Dalton had just received Evans's report, and what he was about to do would shift the balance of power on this flight entirely toward the side of truth. SkyWay Flight 512 was still motionless on the runway, just moments away from taxiing, but inside the business class cabin, the atmosphere had shifted not tense like before, but heavy, quiet, the kind of silence that comes right before a storm breaks. Supervisor Evans had just confirmed that Leonard Hayes's ticket was completely valid. It felt like the situation was resolved. Evans turned away to report to the cockpit, and Clint Morrison, the chief flight attendant, bowed slightly toward Leonard, speaking softly. "Thank you for your patience, sir. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." Leonard nodded, replying in a voice calm as breath, "It's all right. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how we fix them." Clint gave him a grateful look and stepped away. But, across the aisle, Victor Lane sat stiffly, eyes cold, jaw clenched. To him, this silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like humiliation. Under his breath, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, he muttered, "Unbelievable. The whole cabin held up just because someone couldn't give up his precious little seat." Leonard didn't react. He simply opened his laptop again and typed a few notes, as though he hadn't heard a thing. But Victor wasn't done. This time, he spoke louder directly at Leonard. "What makes you think you belong here? Business class seats aren't for people like you. They're for people with class, people who actually contribute something." A few passengers inhaled sharply as if they couldn't believe he actually said it. Clint turned around, but he was too late to stop it. Leonard paused. He closed his laptop gently and turned his head not with anger, but with a steady, direct gaze that made Victor shift in his seat. He spoke softly, but every word carried through the cabin. "Mr. Lane, you're mistaken. Sitting here isn't about class. It's about respect. And I paid for that respect just like everyone else." Victor let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Respect. Do you have any idea how much I spend on this airline I could call the CEO right now? I can make people lose their jobs with one phone call." Leonard tilted his head slightly. A faint smile touched his lips. "I'm sure you could," he said slowly. "But it's interesting, people who talk most about their power are often the ones most afraid no one sees it." The silence that followed was explosive. Victor shot to his feet, face flushed red. "What did you just say?" Leonard didn't flinch. His tone stayed level, almost gentle, like he was explaining something to someone who'd forgotten it. "I said sometimes, people forget that real power isn't in how much money you have. It's in how you treat others when you think you're above them." A woman in seat 3A whispered under her breath, "Oh my God, he's absolutely right." Victor turned, furious. "So now you're lecturing me." Leonard's eyes never wavered. His voice remained calm, quiet but unbreakable. "I'm not lecturing anyone, sir. I'm stating what I believe, and if that bothers you, perhaps the problem isn't me." The cabin froze. Clint stepped in, trying to calm things down. "Gentlemen, please, let's remain civil." Victor lifted a hand to stop him. His voice was sharp. "No, I want to hear him. Who do you think you are? Some lucky man who got to sit here and now thinks he can teach me about ethics." Leonard leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower quiet, but cutting through the air like steel. "No, I'm not lucky. I worked my whole life to sit here, and the only reason this bothers you is because of my skin color." The words dropped like stone. No one moved, no one breathed. Leonard didn't say another word. He leaned back in his seat and turned his gaze to the window where the golden light of the setting sun glowed softly on the glass. The silence stretched on. But in that silence, something had been exposed. Something ugly. Something real. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, he seemed thrown off, not ashamed, but stunned. Nobody had ever said it to his face before. His entire life, he had been admired, obeyed, accommodated. But now a calm, composed black man was speaking truth to him, without fear. And suddenly, his authority felt paper-thin. In the rows behind them, a passenger gave a small, respectful nod. Another rested their hand on the armrest, eyes fixed on Leonard. They didn't speak, but their eyes said it clearly. "We see you. We understand." Supervisor Evans returned just in time to notice the scene. He didn't say anything. He just watched, seeing one man burning with rage, and another sitting in calm resilience. Clint tried once more. "Mr. Lane, please take your seat. We're preparing for takeoff. We need to complete safety procedures." Victor glanced around, then exhaled sharply. He threw one last look at Leonard and hissed, "You're going to regret this." Leonard's reply was almost a whisper. "No, sir. If anyone regrets something here, it won't be me." And with that, he turned back to his laptop and resumed typing his notes, as though the entire confrontation hadn't shaken him at all. Have you ever seen someone win not by arguing, but by refusing to be dragged down? Leonard didn't defeat Victor by yelling louder. He defeated him by staying calm, so calm that everyone could see who truly lost control. The cabin went quiet again. The engines hummed. The airplane began to roll slowly down the runway. But for the passengers who witnessed that moment, they knew they had seen something rare when a man who was insulted chose intelligence over anger, and in doing so, made arrogance collapse on its own. Leonard glanced out the window and thought, sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the loudest voice of someone who knows their worth. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. The confrontation had passed, but he knew it wasn't over, because every time someone stands up to prejudice, the storm doesn't end, it just moves, up ahead. Supervisor Evans was briefing Captain Michael Dalton about what happened in the cabin, and no one yet knew that just minutes from now, Leonard Hayes, the man who was doubted, would be the one to save this flight. SkyWay Flight 512 still hadn't taken off. Everything felt suspended in one long, suffocating breath, heavy, motionless. The situation seemed resolved when Supervisor Evans confirmed that Seat 2C rightfully belonged to Leonard Hayes. But the wounds from those insults were still open, and Victor Lane's bruised pride had not settled. Evans had left the cabin to report to Captain Michael Dalton, while Chief Flight Attendant Clint Morrison tried to calm the passengers. Leonard sat quietly, eyes on the window, his face calm, but deep down, he knew the storm wasn't over, and he was right. Victor suddenly shot up from his seat, pointed at Leonard, and shouted with seething anger, "This is ridiculous! One man is delaying the entire flight. I demand security. I feel threatened." Those last two words, "I feel threatened," rang across the cabin. Short words, but in today's world, they carry weight. Enough weight to turn an innocent person into a suspect. Clint froze. He glanced at Victor, then at Leonard, clearly torn. After one tense second, he lifted his radio and spoke quickly. "Control, this is Morrison on SkyWay 512. We need security assistance in business class. Passenger complaint." Leonard turned back slowly. His expression remained calm. No anger, no panic. While whispers rippled across the cabin, he simply picked up his phone, opened the voice recording app, and sent the audio file to his attorney, Sarah Mitchell. He added a short message, their call in security. "I'm calm. All evidence recorded." Some passengers whispered, their expressions caught between curiosity and discomfort. A few shook their heads. Some looked at Leonard with sympathy. No one spoke, but everyone knew this wasn't about a seat anymore. This was about prejudice and truth. Less than 2 minutes later, 2 airport security officers entered the cabin. One, tall and broad-shouldered, spoke in a firm voice. "Good afternoon. We received a report about a disruptive passenger. Who is Leonard Hayes?" Leonard stood up slowly. His voice was steady. "I am Leonard Hayes, and I want to state clearly I am not being disruptive. I simply refuse to give up the seat I paid for, legally." The officer looked at Victor, then at Clint. "This gentleman says he felt threatened," he said, his voice cold but neutral. Leonard gave a faint, tired but resolute smile. "I understand, but I haven't threatened anyone. I'm sitting in my assigned seat. You're welcome to check the booking system. Supervisor Evans confirmed it just minutes ago." The officer nodded but stayed cautious, radioing quietly into his headset. Victor cut in, voice trembling with anger. "Not power. I don't care about your system. I'm a Platinum Plus member. I've flown this airline for 15 years. I know the rules better than any of you." Leonard's reply was calm, almost gentle, but sharp as glass. "You're right, Mr. Lane. You do have more flying experience than I do. But perhaps I have a little more experience staying calm." A few passengers let out a quiet laugh, not mocking, but stunned by the contrast between them, one furious and shaking, the other composed and unbreakable. The security officer looked around and said, "We will speak with the cabin supervisor to verify. For now, please stay seated and remain quiet." Leonard nodded and sat back down. He sent another message to Sarah. "Everything is being handled. I'm not responding further." Silence, just like we practiced. He remembered Sarah once telling him Leonard, "They can twist your words into weapons, but they can't twist your silence if you control it." And here, in the middle of a plane full of judging eyes, he understood exactly what she meant. Evans returned to the cabin, slightly out of breath, clearly just finished speaking with Captain Dalton. He approached the officers, voice firm. "The seat is valid. Passenger Leonard Hayes is not disruptive. I confirm that." The tension came from a misunderstanding and Mr. Lane's excessive reaction. The officer studied Evans' face, then nodded. "Understood. No violation. We'll file a report and leave." Clint let out a quiet sigh. A few passengers began clapping, not loud, but soft, respectful. A subtle acknowledgement that for once justice hadn't been ignored. Victor Lane's face burned red as he sank back into his seat, avoiding everyone's eyes. He murmured something under his breath, But no one was listening anymore. The image of the powerful man was gone, reduced to the shadow of a pride wounded and exposed. Leonard exhaled softly. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Inside him was only quiet sadness. Sadness that any of this had to happen at all. Sadness that to simply sit in a seat he paid for. He had to fight this hard. Have you ever felt exhausted not from arguing, but from holding yourself together while someone tries to break you apart? Leonard knew that better than anyone. But he also knew losing control is the fastest way to let them win. He typed one last message to Sarah. "It's over. They're gone. Thank you." Sarah replied in under a minute. "Good. You did exactly right. Let truth protect you. They won't forget how you handled this." Leonard gave a faint smile. He reopened his laptop, not to work, but to type something for himself. A reminder. When others choose anger, choose reason. When they choose power, choose truth. Because in the end, truth is the only power that lasts. The late afternoon light filtered in through the window, casting a warm glow on his face. The cabin was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. The quiet of realization. Some passengers looked at Leonard differently now. Not as a troublemaker, but as a man who held his dignity in the middle of a storm. No one said it aloud, but the thought echoed through many minds. He didn't raise his voice, but everyone heard him. The plane finally prepared for takeoff. From the cockpit, Captain Michael Dalton's calm voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're now cleared for departure." Leonard looked around. Everything seemed normal again, but he knew normal would never be the same. Something, whether respect, awareness, or simply human decency, had shifted, just a little. The air in the business class cabin of SkyWay Flight 512 still felt thick, almost solid after the security incident. The officers had left, but the heaviness remained, like a scar that hadn't healed. Leonard Hayes sat quietly, eyes distant as he looked out the window, where the last light of the afternoon glinted off the airplane's wing. Soft whispers drifted through the rows behind him. That man was so calm. I can't believe they treated him like that. That VIP guy went way too far. Leonard heard it all, but didn't react. He simply exhaled softly, his hands resting on his knees. Calm was no longer something he forced, it had become instinct. Then the cabin door opened, and Captain Michael Dalton stepped inside. Tall, straight-backed, sun-weathered skin, deep blue eyes that had seen more than most. The atmosphere changed instantly. Every murmur died. There was something about Dalton that made people fall silent, not out of fear, but out of respect. He spoke in a low, steady voice. "Good afternoon. I'm Captain Dalton. I've been informed there was a seating issue and a passenger incident in this cabin." No one answered. Only Victor Lane sat with arms crossed, jaw tight. Clint Morrison, the chief flight attendant, stepped forward and said carefully, "Captain, there was a misunderstanding over seat assignment. Passenger Victor Lane believed seat 2C belonged to him, but the confirmed ticket was issued to Mr. Leonard Hayes." Dalton looked at Leonard, then at Victor. His gaze moved slowly, as if he was reading everything: anger, embarrassment, pride. "I see," he said. "Then where is Mr. Hayes's booking confirmation?" Supervisor Evans stepped up, holding out the tablet. "Right here. Captain, business class, seat 2C, booked and paid for 22 days ago, fully valid." Dalton nodded once. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that filled the cabin. If the ticket is valid, the passenger has every right to sit in that seat. That's the rule of this airline, and of every airline. No one spoke. Clint lowered his head in relief. Evans exhaled. A few passengers nodded. Someone whispered, "That's how it should be." But Victor Lane shot to his feet, voice rising. "Do you even know who I am? I've flown this airline hundreds of times. I spend millions of dollars with SkyWay. Every year I always sit in that seat." Dalton turned to him steady, unshaken. "Mr. Lane, I know you're a valued long-time passenger, and I appreciate that, but your name is not on that seat. The person who paid for it, his name is. Money can buy service, sir, but it cannot buy someone else's rights." The cabin fell completely still. Dalton's voice hadn't risen once. He wasn't angry, and somehow that made his words even stronger. Victor opened his mouth to argue again, but stopped. Something in Dalton's tone made it clear continuing would only make him look smaller. Leonard looked at Captain Dalton and gave a silent nod. He didn't need to speak. His eyes said thank you. Dalton nodded back and turned to the crew. "I want everyone in position and we take off in 5 minutes. No more disputes." "Yes, Captain," Clint replied immediately. As he walked away, Dalton paused briefly beside Leonard and spoke softly, just for him. "Thank you for staying calm. Not everyone could have," Leonard responded quietly. "I just tried to do the right thing." "Captain." Dalton gave a faint smile. "Sometimes just doing the right thing, that's already an act of courage." Then he left the cabin. And what remained was a different kind of silence, not the silence of fear, but of respect. A few passengers began to clap, not loudly, just a small, grateful applause that spread like a warm ripple. A woman in her 40s murmured, "That captain, he made me believe fairness still exists." Leonard smiled gently, nodded, and turned back to his laptop. He opened the same investment report from earlier, but his mind was no longer on it. Instead, he thought about Dalton, about Evans, about the people who chose to do what was right even when it would have been easier to look away. Inside him, there was a strange mix of relief and sadness, because the things that should be simple fairness, respect, human dignity, had to be defended so fiercely. The plane began to move. The engines hummed deeper. Outside, the world started to slide past the window, slow at first, then faster. Leonard leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't tired, but it felt like he had just walked through a quiet battle. Have you ever felt that sometimes victory isn't making someone bow to you, but keeping your dignity when others lose theirs? Leonard understood that now more than ever. He thought about Captain Dalton's eyes of a man who had seen injustice but still chose to stand on the side of what's right. It reminded him of his father, who once said, "Son, justice isn't something everyone's willing to protect, but if you meet someone who does honor them." As the plane finally lifted off, Leonard opened his eyes and looked out at the sky painted in soft orange light, wide, calm, endless, and inside him, something shifted to faith. Faith in people. The story felt like it was ending, but it wasn't. Because in just a few minutes, the man who was insulted and told to leave his seat would be the one to save this entire flight. Sometimes fate turns quietly right when no one expects it. SkyWay Flight 512 finally took off. After all the arguments, silences, and confrontations, The business-class cabin now held only the steady hum of the engines and the soft golden light of sunset outside the window. Leonard Hayes leaned back slightly, eyes half closed. He wasn't sleeping, just letting his mind drift for a moment after the tension of the past hours. Beside him, Victor Lane sat in silence, his expression heavy, not a trace of the confidence or arrogance he once carried. Deep down, even he seemed to be questioning everything that had just happened. The plane sliced quietly through a thin layer of clouds. The fading sunlight danced across the wing in shades of bronze. Leonard glanced outside, not out of curiosity, but habit. Even though he'd left Boeing almost a decade ago, part of him was still an aerospace engineer. He could read vibrations in an engine, slight wing movements, subtle signs others would never notice, and in that exact moment he saw it. A thin, glimmering trail of liquid gliding across the surface near the left engine. It shimmered in the sunset, not like water vapor or condensation. No, Leonard knew it instantly. Hydraulic fluid. He blinked, leaned forward slightly. The shimmering line grew longer, thin but undeniable, pulled by the wind, reflecting like a silver thread. His heart sank. To most, it meant nothing. To him, a former engineer who once helped design this exact model of engine at Boeing, it meant danger. Serious danger. Leonard took a quiet breath and set his laptop down. He pressed the call button. Clint Morrison, the flight attendant who had spent the afternoon caught between duty and conflict, approached cautiously. "Yes. Mr. Hayes, is everything all right?" Leonard spoke calmly, not panicked, not rushed. "Clint, I need to speak with Captain Dalton. I may be mistaken, but I believe I just saw signs of a hydraulic fluid leak on the left engine." Clint froze for a second. Leak? You mean the outer hydraulic line near the wing root? If I'm right, we could have issues with the landing system or control surfaces. I used to be an aerospace engineer at Boeing. Trust me, it's worth checking. His voice was steady, the voice of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. Clint hesitated, then nodded. "All right, I'll inform the captain." A few minutes later, Captain Michael Dalton appeared. He walked quickly toward Leonard's seat, concern mixed with focus in his eyes. "I heard you saw something unusual." Leonard nodded and pointed out the window. "Right there near the edge of the engine. Do you see that sheen trailing back? If it were condensation, it would evaporate quickly. But that sticks to the airflow. I'm fairly certain it's hydraulic oil." Dalton squinted, following the line of Leonard's finger. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "You've got a sharp eye. I'll check with the engineers immediately." He turned back toward the cockpit, his voice calm but firm over the intercom, SkyWay 512 requesting inspection guidance. Possible hydraulic leak on left engine. The cabin fell into a tense quiet. Clint stood nearby, gripping his radio. Leonard said nothing, eyes still on the wing. Minutes later, Dalton returned this time, his expression serious. "Mr. Hayes, you were right. We're seeing a slight drop in hydraulic pressure. If you hadn't caught it, we could have faced serious issues during landing. I'm requesting clearance to return to the departure airport." Clint let out a breath. "My God." Dalton nodded once, then made an announcement over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Michael Dalton. We've detected a technical issue and will be returning to the airport as a safety precaution. Please remain calm. Everything is under control. But only Dalton and Leonard knew this wasn't a minor technical issue. A hydraulic leak near the wing could cripple landing systems or worse, ignite an engine fire. The plane began its descent. Nervous whispers filled the cabin. Next to Leonard, Victor Lane finally spoke, voice trembling slightly. You're the one who noticed it." Leonard nodded, not taking his eyes off the wing. "I just did what anyone should do when they see something that's not right." Victor looked at him for a long moment. The arrogance was gone. His voice came soft, almost ashamed. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. I was wrong." Leonard gave a small smile. He didn't say anything. Sometimes, real apologies don't need an answer. The aircraft touched down safely. As the engines powered down, a wave of relief swept through the cabin. Some passengers clapped quiet, grateful applause. Captain Dalton walked out of the cockpit, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I want to thank someone on this flight, Mr. Leonard Hayes. Thanks to his sharp observation and expertise, we avoided a potentially dangerous situation. We all owe him our thanks." Every head turned to Leonard. Some passengers stood and applauded. Clint bowed his head slightly. Supervisor Evans smiled sincerely. Leonard nodded humbly. "I only did what anyone should do when they see something wrong, whether on the ground or in the sky." In silence, Victor Lane lowered his gaze. The very seat he had tried so hard to take was the seat from which the man he once dismissed saved his life. No dramatic music, no glory speech, just a quiet, irreversible shift. Leonard stood, picked up his coat. He glanced once more out the window, the hydraulic fluid now clearly visible along the wing. It was proof, a quiet reminder of a strange truth, that the man who didn't belong was the one who kept everyone safe. Have you ever seen the world turn upside down in silence when the one overlooked becomes the one holding everything together? That was this moment. And for Leonard Hayes, it wasn't a victory. It was a confirmation. Dignity isn't something others grant you. It's something you hold on to, especially when the world tries to take it away. When SkyWay Flight 512 finally landed safely, the people on board still hadn't fully recovered. The cabin lights came on, casting soft reflections across every face, tired, tense, but overflowing with relief and gratitude. Leonard Hayes sat quietly in seat 2C, eyes still gazing out the window. Under the floodlights of the runway, the airplane wing glistened faintly with the same trace of hydraulic fluid he had noticed just hours before. A thin line of leakage, small but powerful enough to change everything. Captain Michael Dalton emerged from the cockpit. He walked straight toward Leonard, voice low and steady but filled with a respect that everyone in the cabin could feel. "Mr. Hayes, on behalf of the entire flight crew and all 247 passengers, thank you. If it weren't for your observation, I'm afraid things could have ended very differently." Leonard gave a faint smile and replied softly, "Thank you, Captain. I just did what anyone should do when they see something isn't right." Dalton placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Yes, but not everyone could have done what you did, especially after what you just went through." No one else in the cabin spoke, but all eyes were on Leonard, eyes filled with respect. The same man who had been asked to give up his seat, dismissed, even reported to security for causing trouble, was now the one who had saved them. Across the aisle, Victor Lane sat silent, his face pale, his head bowed. The arrogance, the entitlement, it was gone, as if it had never existed. Supervisor Evans stepped up beside him and said quietly, "Mr. Lane, please come with us. Captain Dalton would like to speak with you privately." Victor lifted his head, voice weak. Is that really necessary?" Evans cut him off, firm but calm. "It is, sir." Victor stood, avoiding everyone's eyes, and followed Evans out of the cabin. The silence that remained was heavy, like a breath held too long. Clint Morrison, the chief flight attendant, walked toward Leonard, his face full of remorse. "Mr. Hayes, I want to apologize for how I treated you earlier. I thought I was just following protocol, but clearly I was wrong." Leonard looked at him, his voice gentle as a whisper. "It's all right. Clint, some lessons we all have to learn ourselves. What matters is that you understand it now." Clint lowered his head. "I've learned that sometimes. Protocol can't replace respect." Many passengers nodded quietly as people prepared to leave the plane. Captain Dalton asked Leonard to wait a moment. He made a call, then handed Leonard the phone. "Mr. Hayes, there's someone who wants to speak with you. I think you should take this." Leonard raised an eyebrow, but took the phone. A voice came through, deep, steady, unmistakably authoritative. "Leonard, it's me, Thomas Bradley, CEO of SkyWay Airlines." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Dalton stood still. Clint's eyes widened. Thomas Leonard said calmly, "It's been a while." "Yes," Thomas replied, a hint of embarrassment in his tone. "I just received the report. You saved our flight. Thank you. I have to admit, when I first saw the name Leonard Hayes, I didn't realize. I didn't know it was you. I didn't know you were Skyway's largest shareholder." Gasps spread quietly across the cabin. Clint stammered. "Largest shareholder." Leonard remained composed. He ended the short call and set the phone down. Then he looked around the cabin and spoke not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, I am a shareholder of Skyway. I invested in this airline because I believe in people that respect and safety should be the foundation of every flight. But today, I saw that's not always how things go." The cabin fell silent. No one said a word. Leonard continued, not angry, but with a quiet sadness and unwavering conviction. "I'm not upset because I was insulted. I'm disappointed that for fairness to exist, I had to reveal who I am, because out there, many people don't have status or shares. What happens to them if they're treated the way I was today?" His words weren't loud, but somehow they weighed heavier than any shout. Captain Dalton stood tall, his voice firm and sincere. "Mr. Hayes, on behalf of the entire crew, I'm sorry. I promise this airline will reevaluate our protocols and our behavior today. No one should ever be treated that way, no matter who they are." Leonard nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Captain. I believe you will do the right thing." Evans returned and added quietly, "Victor Lane has been removed from the flight and will face internal investigation. Skyway will not tolerate discrimination or threats against passengers." A few passengers began to clap softly at first. Then, spreading across the cabin, a gentle applause for the truth finally being acknowledged. Leonard didn't smile triumphantly. He didn't look proud or vengeful. He simply looked peaceful. Because this wasn't about winning over someone, it was about winning over prejudice. As passengers began to disembark, an elderly woman who had been sitting behind him the entire flight approached and gently held his hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said, voice trembling slightly, "you didn't just save us. You reminded me that kindness still exists in this loud, messy world." Leonard squeezed her hand gently and smiled softly. "Thank you. I think we all need to believe that every day." Outside, night had fallen. Airport lights stretched across the tarmac like a river of stars. Leonard inhaled deeply. He knew this story would spread not because he was a shareholder, but because it carried something larger. A reminder for anyone who's ever been looked down on, and for anyone who ever thought they were above others. He turned for one last look at the wing of the plane, where the faint line of hydraulic fluid still glimmered under the lights. A symbol of danger. Yes, but also a symbol of clarity, dignity, and reason. There are things money can't buy, Leonard thought, and true respect is one of them. 3 days after the fateful SkyWay 512 flight, the name Leonard Hayes appeared across every news outlet in America, not as a hero, but as a symbol of calm intelligence in the face of injustice. On CNN's morning broadcast, the anchor read the headline, "Passenger asked to give up his seat for a VIP. Turns out he's a major shareholder of the airline, and he's the one who saved the plane from disaster." The story spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, the hashtag "Respect in the Air" had been used millions of times on Twitter, then spilled over to Facebook, YouTube, and civil rights forums. People didn't share it because it was dramatic. They shared it because it touched something everyone had felt before being underestimated, mistreated, judged unfairly, but not everyone has the strength to respond with grace instead of anger. On NPR radio, a woman said during a live interview, "I don't know who Mr. Hayes is, but when he said, 'I just did the right thing,' I felt like he was speaking for so many of us." Meanwhile, at SkyWay Airlines headquarters in Dallas, an emergency meeting lasted through the night. Thomas Bradley, the company's CEO and the man who had called Leonard right there at the airport, sat silently in front of the large screen as the cabin footage played, Leonard calmly refusing to move seats. Standing his ground before Victor Lane, and then spotting the hydraulic leak that saved them all. For 10 whole minutes, no one in the room spoke. The only sound was Leonard's quiet, steady voice echoing through the speakers. "Finally," Thomas whispered, almost to himself. "That man didn't just save our flight, he saved SkyWay's dignity." Then he turned to the board, his voice firm. "We cannot treat this like a minor incident. This is a wake-up call. A company can lose money, it can lose customers. But if it loses people's trust and respect, it loses everything." The next morning, SkyWay Airlines held a national press conference before hundreds of reporters. Thomas Bradley stepped up to the microphone exhausted, but resolute. "We formally apologize to Mr. Leonard Hayes for what occurred on Flight 512. Disrespect and racial bias, whether explicit or subtle, are against the core values of our company. We will not tolerate it." The room fell completely silent. He continued, "All crew members involved will face independent investigation. 2 employees who violated code of conduct have been terminated. Passenger Victor Lane, who harassed and threatened another passenger, is banned from all SkyWay flights permanently." Reporters began whispering. Cameras clicked rapidly. Thomas looked straight into the lens. "From today, SkyWay Airlines is creating the $50 million Equity and Respect in the Air Fund. It will support anti-bias training, crew accountability, and passenger rights protection. This is not just a promise to Mr. Hayes, it's a promise to society. Leonard avoided the spotlight. When the New York Times asked for an interview, he simply said, "I don't want to be the center of attention. I just want people to understand sometimes. Justice begins with a calm voice, not a loud one." He declined television interviews. He didn't want this turned into entertainment. He wanted it to remain a message. Sarah Mitchell, his attorney, said that on the day SkyWay announced the $50 million fund, Leonard only said one thing: "If they really change, I'll keep flying with them." At SkyWay headquarters, emails from employees began arriving in Leonard's inbox not to apologize, but to thank him. A young flight attendant wrote, "Thank you. You showed us that standing up for what's right can start with calmness, not anger." A SkyWay engineer sent a handwritten letter. "I'm proud you were once one of us, a fellow engineer. Today, you didn't just save lives. You made this industry feel honorable again." On social media, people shared the video clip of Leonard sitting quietly, saying, "I paid for respect." That sentence became a symbol printed on shirts, turned into hashtags, quoted in corporate ethics classes, even spoken in graduation speeches. Some revolutions don't begin with fire or noise. They begin when one ordinary person looks injustice in the eye and says, "No." Leonard Hayes did that not with rage, but with reason. That evening, Leonard stood on the balcony of his apartment in Seattle, overlooking the lights of the city. Cold wind drifted from Puget Sound, carrying the smell of salt and water. His phone buzzed with thousands of notifications, messages, interviews, requests. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he opened one video file, the recording of the flight. At the exact moment, Captain Dalton said, "Because of Mr. Hayes's observation, we avoided disaster." Leonard watched in silence, not proud, not triumphant, just quiet, like someone who had stitched back a part of his faith in humanity. Maybe, he thought, this world can get better if people just choose to do the right thing at the right time. He smiled faintly, put his phone down, and walked back inside, outside. The hashtag, respect in the air, kept spreading, not loud, but steady like a soft wind carrying one message: dignity has no price, and respect must never be negotiable. 1 month after the SkyWay 512 incident, Leonard Hayes's life had changed, but he lived just as simply as before. He still woke up at 5 a.m., ran along Lake Union in Seattle, and went to his office at Horizon Capital, the investment firm he founded. Every morning, though, when he checked his phone, there were dozens of emails from strangers. A black single father in Atlanta wrote to thank him for teaching his son that being calm doesn't mean being weak. A young flight attendant from Ohio said that because of his story, she finally had the courage to speak up when she saw a colleague treat a passenger unfairly. Others, people who had been judged, ignored, or dismissed, said they felt seen for the first time. Leonard read every message. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he simply put his phone down and exhaled softly. He never imagined that a quiet moment on an airplane could give millions of people a little more faith. One morning, an invitation arrived from the National Aviation Association of the United States. They wanted Leonard to be the keynote speaker at the National Aviation Conference in Washington, D.C. "Mr. Hayes," the representative said over the phone, "we're not inviting a shareholder. We're inviting a symbol. Your story made the aviation industry look in the mirror." Leonard was silent for a moment. He had never enjoyed public speaking, but this time he knew there are things that, if he didn't say them, no one else would. The day of the conference, the grand hall of the National Convention Center glowed under bright lights. Over 700 people were there: airline executives, lawmakers, journalists, engineers. On the screen behind the stage appeared the event's title, National Aviation Conference, theme Dignity in the Skies. When Leonard Hayes' name was announced, the entire hall stood and applauded. Some had seen him on the news. Some only knew him from Respect in the Air. But all of them wanted to hear from the man who changed an entire industry with calmness, not rage. Leonard walked onto the stage steady, composed. He wore a deep navy suit, no tie just like on SkyWay 512. He smiled slightly, glanced at the room, and began, "Thank you. I'm not a politician. I'm not a professional speaker. I'm just a passenger, someone who was once asked to give up his own seat." The hall chuckled softly, but no one thought he was joking, because the truth in his words stung a little. He continued, "That day, I didn't get angry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I knew that if I reacted the way they expected, I'd lose the one thing that mattered most, my dignity. And strangely enough, it was that calmness that made people listen." The room fell silent. He looked across the audience faces of every color, every background. We live in a time where everyone wants to be right, but we forget that sometimes what's right must be spoken with listening, not shouting. I don't want anyone to go through what I did, but I know this real change doesn't come from anger. It comes from standing firm in respect. A wave of applause rolled across the hall. Leonard went on, voice low but unwavering. "On that flight, I was just a man protecting my seat. But now I understand keeping your seat is not always about personal comfort. Sometimes it's about protecting everyone's right to have one. If I had given up that seat, I wouldn't just have lost a place to sit. I would have lost the voice of everyone who's been told they don't belong." The room stayed completely still. "Dignity," he said softly, "is not in a first-class ticket, a bank account, or a business card. It's in how we treat others, especially when we think they don't matter." Down in the front row, a woman HR director of a major airline quietly wiped her tears. Leonard looked at her, then back at the audience. "I know most people in this industry don't intend to create bias, but silence in the face of bias is part of the problem too. We can change not with slogans, but with small actions every day. A look, a word, a decision. It can be the difference between making someone feel they belong or making them feel they don't." The entire auditorium stood and applauded. Leonard bowed his head slightly. He didn't smile like someone who had won. He smiled like someone who had survived a storm and learned that stillness can be strength. American media called it the quietest, loud moment of the year. No fiery slogans, no anger, just experience and belief. Within a week, more than 20 airlines announced they were launching Respect in the Air training programs based on Leonard's principles: fairness, dignity, and calm in every situation. The video of Leonard's speech hit tens of millions of views. Many older viewers shared it with this caption: "He's right. Sometimes respect isn't a shout. Sometimes it's a steady, honest look." That night, Leonard came home, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window. He thought of SkyWay 512, of Captain Dalton, of Clint Morrison, of Victor Lane, who, he had heard, voluntarily enrolled in bias awareness training. Maybe, he thought, every change begins when someone chooses to stop and look at themselves. The Seattle night wind crept through the window, carrying the scent of rain. Leonard sipped his tea and smiled softly. He wasn't angry anymore, because what he wanted had happened not through power, but through quiet resilience and human decency. 3 months after Leonard Hayes' speech at the National Aviation Conference, America was still talking about him not as a viral sensation, but as a turning point in the aviation industry. On the cover of Aviation Weekly, bold letters read, "From modern respectin' the air to real reform, SkyWay Airlines is rewriting the rules." Another article began. The story of one black passenger forced the entire U.S. aviation system to reconsider how it treats human beings. At SkyWay's headquarters, changes were happening faster than anyone expected. CEO Thomas Bradley initiated a series of unprecedented reforms. A new passenger Bill of Rights was introduced guaranteeing that any traveler, regardless of seat class or status, could file an immediate complaint if they felt disrespected or discriminated against. Mandatory anti-bias and dignity training became required not only for flight attendants and ground staff, but also for senior executives and managers. SkyWay signed a contract with an independent ethics and equity audit firm, a move no other airline had ever taken. And most importantly, SkyWay founded the Aviation Culture and Safety Oversight Council, made up of sociologists, human rights attorneys, and aerospace engineers. Among them, as an honorary advisor, was Leonard Hayes. No one forced Leonard to accept the role. In a private meeting, Thomas Bradley said, "Mr. Hayes, no one understands the value of respect in the air better than you. I want you to help us protect it." Leonard stayed silent for a moment, then simply replied, "I won't be the spokesperson. Thomas, I just want to be the reminder so we never forget why this began." From his quiet office in Seattle, Leonard became a calm shadow behind the reforms. He didn't appear in advertisements, he didn't go on television, but at the start of every new SkyWay employee training session, a video played Leonard, sitting in a softly lit room, saying, "I was once asked to give up my seat, even though I paid for it. But what mattered wasn't what happened to me. It was how people responded afterward. I don't want that day to be remembered for anger, but for the question it forces us to ask, are we really seeing people or only seeing what we think they are?" Many flight attendants confessed that video made them cry. 3 months later, Leonard decided to fly once more on SkyWay Airlines, a morning flight from Seattle to Chicago. At the check-in counter, a young Latina staff member smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. We're honored to have you with us today." Leonard blinked, surprised. "You know who I am?" She chuckled. "All of us do. But don't worry, I'm not asking for a photo. I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, our job means more now." Leonard smiled. "Thank you. Just keep doing your job well. That's enough." Boarding the plane, he noticed something different. No wary stares, no subtle distance. A middle-aged flight attendant approached with a friendly nod. "Welcome back. Mr. Hayes, your favorite seat 2C is ready." Leonard laughed softly. Seat 2C. Hard to forget that one. He sat down. The cabin was still luxurious, but felt lighter, kinder. A young black passenger sat in the next row, laughing comfortably with a white couple. The sound of their laughter drifted through the cabin, and Leonard felt something ease inside his chest. Small changes, but enough to change a day. After the flight, Leonard attended a small press briefing where SkyWay announced its results. 94% of passengers said they now felt more respected and treated more fairly on board. complaints involving discriminatory behavior had dropped by nearly 70%. And surprisingly, employee satisfaction was at its highest point in 10 years. A reporter asked Mr. Hayes, "What do you think is the biggest change?" Leonard looked around, paused, then answered, "The biggest change isn't in the numbers, it's in people's eyes. That day on Flight 512, I saw fear, doubt, prejudice. Today I see people willing to listen, and to me, that's the beginning of hope." Applause filled the room. That night, Leonard went home and turned on the TV. A news segment showed other airlines following SkyWay's lead implementing training, forming independent oversight boards, updating transparency policies. The anchor's voice said, from what seemed like a small incident, U.S. Aviation is entering a new era of reform, one built on two words: respect first. Leonard switched off the TV and leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly. He felt no anger, no desire to be called a hero, just peace, the kind he'd been searching for his whole life in a world filled with bias. Outside, the Seattle sunset washed the sky in soft orange. Leonard stood, poured another cup of tea, and thought, maybe sometimes to change the world, you don't need to shout, you just need to stand still, speak truth, and refuse to give up your seat to what's wrong. 3 months later, a quiet morning in Seattle. The city was just waking up. Mist still hovered over Lake Union, and sunlight hadn't yet touched the glass towers along the shore. In a high-rise apartment, Leonard Hayes sat at an old wooden table, a cup of green tea gently steaming beside him. His laptop was open, but not to a financial report or an investment file. On the screen was a video window, waiting for him to press record. He sat in silence for a while. The pale morning light touched his face, revealing the fine lines around his eyes, marks of someone who had lived through battles. Not wars fought with guns, but the quiet kind battles of dignity and patience. Leonard took a sip of tea. Then he began to speak. His voice was low, calm, and real, not polished like a public speaker, just a man telling the truth he had lived. 3 months ago, I took a flight I'll never forget. I was asked to give up the seat I paid for because someone else was considered more important. But what I learned that day is this: sometimes, to protect what's right, you don't have to raise your voice. You just have to stay where you know you have the right to be. He paused, eyes drifting for a moment as if the memory were still alive in front of him. Not long after, that same flight had a mechanical issue. I noticed a hydraulic leak, and we landed safely. The man who said I didn't deserve that seat was the same man whose life I helped save. Life is strange like that. Sometimes, the people we look down on are the ones who end up holding our fate. A faint smile grew on his face, worn, but peaceful. I'm not telling this story to make anyone feel guilty, and I don't want praise. I'm telling it because I want us to remember change begins with small acts. It begins when you dare to say, "No, I deserve respect." And it also begins when you dare to look at a stranger and think, they deserve it too. He stopped the recording. For a moment, he sat there in silence. Then Leonard took a long breath, looked at the video on the screen, moved his cursor to the post button, and typed a title: "Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right." He clicked upload. The video went live on his X Twitter account, an account where he rarely posted anything more than tech or investment notes. Within hours, it spread like wind. Hundreds of thousands of shares. Millions of views. People called it the quietest yet strongest video of the year. A journalist at the Washington Post wrote, "Leonard Hayes didn't call for protests. He didn't accuse or condemn. He simply told his story, and in doing so, made the world look at itself." News outlets around the globe picked it up. BBC, Al Jazeera, Le Monde, different languages, same message. Respect begins with small things. A teacher in South Africa played the video in her ethics class. A university in Canada added it to a course called Leadership in Crisis. An airline in Japan reached out not for marketing but to build a culture of dialogue and dignity in the skies. And Leonard, he kept living his ordinary life, drove himself to work, had lunch in the company cafeteria with junior analysts, drank the same green tea, ran the same morning route. One afternoon, Sarah Mitchell, his lawyer and old friend, called and said, "You know that video, it just passed 50 million views." Leonard chuckled. "Really good. I just hope at least a small part of that helps people treat each other a little better." That night, Leonard received a message from Victor Lane, the same man who once humiliated him on that flight. It read, "I watched your video. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know you made me want to be a better man." Leonard read it, closed his phone gently, and whispered to himself, "That's the real victory." That late afternoon, the sky over Seattle faded into a pale shade of orange. The wind from Lake Union slipped through the open window of the 20th floor apartment, gently touching the white curtains. Leonard Hayes sat at his desk. His laptop screen glowed softly, reflecting on his calm, mature face, still carrying that quiet sadness only those who've endured more than they ever expected to. On the screen, the video window was already open, waiting for him to press record. He looked into the camera for a long moment, as if deciding how to begin. Then he took a deep breath, gave a small nod, and started. His voice, deep, slow, sincere, sounded less like a speech and more like a conversation with an old friend. I think all of us, at some point in our lives, face a moment where we must choose stay silent or stand up for what's right. For me, that moment was on a plane, and I chose not to stay silent. He paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. That day, I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted to be treated fairly like everyone else. But what I didn't expect was that a small, quiet action could make an entire system look at itself. Leonard lowered his head slightly, a soft, rueful smile crossing his face. I used to think big change only came from power or position. Now I understand sometimes. It starts when an ordinary person dares to say no to something that's wrong. His hand rested gently on the table. He continued. If you've ever been overlooked, pushed aside, I want you to know you're not alone, and you don't have to shout to be heard. Just stay calm, speak truth, and never let anyone make you doubt your own worth. He stopped recording. For a moment, he sat still. Then Leonard watched the video, moved his cursor, and typed the title, "Respect Begins," with one voice. He clicked Post. The video went live on his ex Twitter account, where he rarely shared personal thoughts. But this time, in just hours, it spread everywhere. No background music, no dramatic cuts, just a man in a quiet room telling the truth softly enough to make people silent. A white woman in Texas commented, "I'm 67. I've flown hundreds of times, but I've never thought this deeply about respecting a stranger. Thank you, Mr. Hayes." A 20-year-old from New York wrote, "This is the first time I've seen someone win, by being calm. I'll remember that forever." And among the millions of comments, one stood out so simple that Leonard read it again and again. "Thank you for not being angry. Because you weren't, we got to see something greater dignity." Leonard's story didn't just stay in America. BBC, The Guardian, NHK, Al Jazeera all shared the video. Airlines in Europe and Asia began adopting respect in the air programs following what SkyWay Airlines started after the incident. A human rights professor in Toronto called it the quietest moral lesson of the 21st century. A university in California added it to their course, Leadership and Integrity. And while the world talked, Leonard stayed the same. No talk shows, no book deals, no sponsorships. Every morning he still ran around Lake Union, stopping at the same wooden bench to watch the sunrise settle over the water. One morning, while sitting there, his phone buzzed. A message from Victor Lane, the man who had once humiliated him on Flight 512. "I watched your video. I don't expect forgiveness, but thank you for not treating me the way I treated you. You saved me not just on that flight, but from my own pride." Leonard stared at the message for a long time. Then he closed his phone, looked out over the still water, and whispered to himself, "No one wins by hatred, but anyone can win with respect." A week later, SkyWay Airlines announced the creation of the Air Dignity Fund to support education, career access, and equity training for young people of color entering aviation. Leonard didn't stand on stage that day. He sat quietly in the back row. When CEO Thomas Bradley mentioned his name, the entire hall stood to applaud. Leonard didn't speak. He only smiled, eyes glistening softly. "I don't need titles," he thought. "I just want a future where no one has to go through what I did. That's enough." That night, Leonard returned home and rewatched his own video. He saw the man on the screen calm, simple, kind, and smiled gently. The last light of the sunset reflected through the window, warm against his face. "Change doesn't happen in a day," he whispered. "It comes little by little when someone chooses respect instead of anger, understanding instead of judgment, and when an ordinary person chooses to stand not with a shout, but with a quiet voice." Leonard closed his eyes. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Airplanes still crossed the night sky. But to him, the world already felt different, calmer, kinder, and more worth believing in. Sometimes, life doesn't test us with grand tragedies. It tests us in quiet moments. Moments when we're overlooked, underestimated, or judged simply because of how we look or where we come from. The story of Leonard Hayes. The man asked to give up his seat for a VIP, yet chose to remain calm, reminds us of something powerful. Real strength isn't found in shouting. It's found in holding on to your dignity when things are unfair. Leonard didn't fight with anger. He responded with wisdom, and that calmness, that quiet courage, is what forced an entire system to change. We can't control how others treat us, but we can always control how we respond. That's the line between being hurt and becoming an inspiration. Leonard's lesson isn't just for the airline industry, it's for all of us. At work, at home, in society, choose respect, even when you aren't given any, because every small act of decency, every honest word spoken at the right time, can be the beginning of something bigger for you and for the world around you. Thank you for being here and for staying till the end of this story. If you believe respect can change the world, hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Together, let's keep spreading stories that honor intelligence, courage, and human dignity.